Okay, this is the addendum to the fat burning chapter. I ran 2 cycles of the fat burner and I detailed that, but when I filmed that, I hadn't yet run a 3rd cycle. Obviously the first cycle was the best. Didn't really have any side effects, didn't have anything go wrong, everything kind of went to plan, and it worked real well. Second run, still worked really well. Added in the loading component. I had some water retention, but it still worked well. Then I ran it for the 3rd time. I started this 3rd cycle on a Wednesday, just like I did the other 2. And by Saturday, I was at a baseball game and noticed that I had quite a bit of water retention. And when I say quite a bit of water retention, my feet were pretty plump. I was clearly holding water in the bottom half of my shin to the point where I thought to myself, this is kind of strange because this is similar to what happened when I loaded during the 2nd run, but I hadn't loaded. I knew that during this 3rd run that I wasn't going to do any loading because I felt like the problems that I had during the 2nd run were primarily related to loading and increasing my carbohydrate intake. What I didn't know and found out after this 3rd run when I was able to look back and kind of assess and analyze what had happened and why things deteriorated from such a good run the first time to moderately effective with starting to get side effects the 2nd time to a complete disaster the 3rd time was primarily because I was running these cycles way too close together. So I started this run on a Wednesday. By Saturday, I had a lot of water retention, pretty concerning. Typically, water retention for me and for most people doesn't really start to increase until later in the day. We're walking around a lot, we're sitting a lot, whatever. The water retention starts to build later in the day or at night. On Saturday, I was probably only 3 hours into my day and was noticing quite a bit of water retention. I've got a cat over here that is going to now decide that he's going to try to talk the other 2 cats into having sex with him, not knowing that those 2 cats are fixed. So if you hear any meowing, it's my dumbass male cat. Didn't think too much of the water retention, even though it was on my mind. I figured, maybe my water intake is low. I've been at a ball game all day. Increased my water intake, thought it would help, and it really didn't. It started to get worse throughout the day and was at its worst later that night, which was Saturday night. Got up on Sunday, and some of that water had cleared. The first hour or 2 I was up, I thought, okay, cool. I'm in a better spot than I was yesterday. I probably just didn't have enough water. Made sure that I had plenty of water on Sunday, but the same thing happened throughout the day. And it started to get back to the point where it was on Saturday. So I looked at 3 options essentially. My first option was I was just going to stop the cycle even only 4 days in and just be like, screw it. I've ran it twice. I'm pretty fucking lean, so I don't know that I need to run it anyway. Number 2 option was to just obviously see it through for the 14 days that I had planned, continue to run it at 250 milligrams a day like I had for the other 2 cycles, and just kind of let it run its course, make sure that my water intake was high enough, my mineral supplementation was where it was supposed to be, and of course not load. I knew with the water retention that I had at that point from not loading, if I were to have changed my mind and said, I'm going to load for just a meal or 2, I probably would have been in a pretty bad spot. Number 3 option was I had considered upping the dosage from 250 to 500 milligrams for about a week and then calling it quits instead of at 14 days at 10 days. Now, some of you are probably rolling your eyes thinking, gosh, Skip, you're smarter than that. And that's fine. Maybe I deserve that. The reality is I'm kind of a curious guy. Most of us are. I do my learning by experimenting. I fancy myself pretty cautionary for the most part. I've always been cautious with my gear intake. I've always been cautious with injuries, my lower back issues, that sort of thing. Any of you who know me or have followed me for any length of time will know that. And that's why my decision to choose option 3 is probably going to seem borderline absurd. My thinking really was, I'm taking in enough water. Upping the dosage is not going to likely to increase my water retention. It'll probably just stay the same. Now, hindsight is always 20/20, and it didn't take me 6 hours to regret that decision on Monday. Because on Monday, I ended up that I went from 250 to 500 milligram, not all at once. I typically take my 250 milligram dose once a day, a couple hours after I get up with a meal. And on Monday, I took the second dose at roughly 12 hours so that I would, or the plan was, to take 250 milligrams every 12 hours instead of taking a 500 milligram dose once every 24 hours. I took that 250 milligram dose, and in 5 to 6 hours, I knew I was essentially in trouble or in a really bad position. Now, understand that while you're thinking this may be stupid, I'm putting this information out there because if I make this mistake or use poor judgment in a situation like this, I can guarantee that there are other people out there who can make the same decisions or at least are on the fence wondering whether they should or not. And I'm putting this information out there to tell you matter-of-factly that you shouldn't. So the water retention increase, and I'm looking down at my notes because there's a lot that went on and I wanted to make sure that the information that I am conveying here on video is completely and 100% accurate because it's been a couple months since it happened, between when it happened and when I am videoing or filming this information. So I upped the dose. So I got the water retention by 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. I know I'm in a pretty bad spot here. I know that my water is high, so I know that's not the issue. My supplementation of electrolytes is where it's supposed to be. I haven't done anything differently, and I know that I haven't loaded. So there's really nothing at this point to kind of blame it on. And I'll explain here when I'm done going through the situation, what happened, looking back on everything, what I would change if I ever were to use this compound again, and I'm not real sure that I will, and really what went wrong. Monday night, I did not sleep. Breathing became labored. Okay, and by labored, I mean because I've had a lot of people contact me since this happened and said, well, sometimes I get out of breath when, I'm training or, I climb a flight of stairs or something because my weight is so big. And the cats are now going to knock a ton of shit over only while I'm filming. Yay. Anyway, been approached by clients who have asked me and thought, oh, well, I'm probably out of breath too. Is this what you experienced? No. Okay, labored breathing in a situation like mine is completely different than being out of breath because your weight is heavier and that sort of thing. Okay. I'll get to it in a minute, but basically this is the beginning of the onset of congestive heart failure. Okay, when I say it's labored breathing, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being you can't inhale and fill your lungs and get a satisfying breath, 10 being you can't exhale all of your air. I was right in that 4 to 5 or 4 to 5.5 range where I was breathing mid-range. I could not take a deep breath to where you take that deep breath and you're satisfied. Here's a good way to explain it. After a big meal and you've really filled yourself and you get that feeling where you have to take a big deep breath, but it's not satisfying because you feel like you can't get to the top of that breath, like it falls short. That's what it was times 10. So not being able to take a deep breath like that really was just causing myself to be that much more anxious, which was exacerbating the problem anyway. So I had to work really hard, and I don't have anxiety problems. I've never had anxiety problems in my life, but this was a different situation. So I had to work really hard to control my breathing. Okay, at this point, just to be very, very clear and very transparent, it's difficult to control your anxiety when you're scared shitless. And that's really where I was. I was incredibly concerned, knowing the half-life of this compound is very long, and it's not something that's going to pass in the next handful of hours, or maybe even the next 12 or so hours. So I knew I had a long road ahead of me before things were going to get better. Understand too that while I'm breathing like this, I'm trying to maintain and keep myself calm and keep anxiety down. But I'm getting really tired because it's starting to get late at night. And even though I stay up late to work and everything else, it's 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I can't lay down because when I lay down, I feel like I can't breathe. Another scary situation. So much so that I didn't even want to lay down and did not sleep that night. I stayed up, sitting in my seat, did a little bit of work, watched TV, ended up talking to my wife about, I was a little concerned, but I kind of downplayed it because I didn't want her to get scared or get worried or anything else. Let me tell you something though, and not all of you have kids, and I get that, but I do. And that night when I didn't sleep, they were upstairs sleeping soundly, not knowing that their dad was downstairs wondering what the fuck was going to happen and was trying to control his breathing because he was very clear that the onset of congestive heart failure symptoms were prevalent. It's a very unnerving feeling when, especially when you're already ridiculously lean anyway like I was, and this decision to not only run a third cycle of DNP, but to up the dose was pushing the envelope, and that would probably be a gross understatement. I think it was easy to justify the decision because I'm thinking to myself, oh, I'm a pretty safe guy, I'm pretty cautious, I'm a TRT guy, I made all these decisions to be healthier, I'm just going to run DNP again, but this time I'm going to do it right, I'm not going to load, and I'm not going to have any problems. Which logically, if you think about it, does make sense. I only had those problems running it the second time because I was loading and adding carbs. So I figured, again logically, that running it this third time would not be an issue if I didn't load. And I was very, very wrong. And I think that's one of the bigger problems with a compound like this, is when things go right, it's no big deal. You end up coming out of it much like I did out of the first cycle going, what's the big deal? Like, it worked really well. I had no sides. I didn't hold any water. My condition was awesome. And I just got tighter and tighter. It's not when everything's going right, and it goes right for the large majority of people who use it. It's when shit goes south that you start to get into a situation where when it's the perfect storm and one decision that you don't know is bad feeds off of another one, and then conditions come together perfectly, you end up in a world of shit. And even though I was having a hard time with my breathing, I was very clear in my head, incredibly clear actually, that I was in a world of shit. And I had to figure out a way out of it. So I get into Tuesday. I have not eaten. I have not slept. The breathing is about the same. I don't really know what I'm going to do other than just kind of wait it out. Even drinking water, putting anything in my stomach at all. My supplements, I had to continue to take the supplements, the electrolyte supplements, because I knew that because I was having so much water retention, something was off with my electrolytes, way off. So to not take those electrolytes, I knew would probably be an incredibly terrible decision. Now understand this. When you feel like your diaphragm or that your lungs you can't get that full feeling, again, much like if you have a big meal in your stomach, it's difficult for you to get that big breath and to fill up your lungs. This is the situation I was in. So anything that went into my stomach, even a small amount of water with supplements, would take up space and make the breathing that much more difficult. Now, it wasn't like if I would have eaten a meal, but the point was I needed all the room that I could get. So I didn't want to drink much water, but I knew I had to. So I was clearly not drinking as much water as I could or that I should, because I just felt like I couldn't get it in there, and I didn't want my breathing to be labored. So it was a balancing act. I wanted to get enough that it didn't make the situation worse, but at the same time, I didn't want to take in any more than I needed because I knew that the breathing was going to be bad and that I would then have to battle again to try to maintain myself not getting anxious and keep myself calm. Again, you're scared out of your fucking mind. You're trying to make decisions that are in your best interest, and yet water was going to be in my best interest. Supplements were going to be in my best interest for my electrolytes, and yet I knew that that was going to be detrimental because it was going to make it hard for me to breathe again, or harder. It was still hard, but it was going to be made even that much more harder and that much more labored. Now, when I talk about holding water, at this point, I'm holding roughly, and I didn't know this until after, so I was able to weigh myself and then let the water fall off after this all was said and done. But I was holding roughly 30 pounds of water. Okay, that's a ridiculous amount of water no matter what you weigh. But without holding any water, I was in the 210 range, 208, in there somewhere. So you can imagine, my weight is now up to roughly 240. Okay, that's concerning. Come here, stupid. Come here, Thor. Come here, sweetie. Come on. Come here. That's a lot of water. So what it is it gets concerning. Come here, big guy. I'm going to keep you quiet. Say hi to Thor. He's the new addition. He's Mr. Male, and he's chasing he's chasing Zuri and Loki around thinking he's going to get some ass. And they're fixed, stupid. They don't want anything to do with you. So, goodness. It gets into Tuesday. Middle of the day. Understand, this is a fat burner. This is a powerful fat burner. Everybody's hungry on this fat burner, right? I'm ravenous, especially because I'm not fucking eating. I'm not eating anything. I don't want to put one small bite of anything in my stomach, even though I'm ravenously hungry, because I don't want to not be able to breathe. So I'm not eating anything. Okay, so now I haven't slept. I'm exhausted. I'm battling the anxiety, trying to stay calm, trying to make sure that I breathe, trying to make sure that I'm getting enough water and my electrolytes in, and I cannot eat and I'm starving. To say I'm starving is a gross understatement. I think if I were able to get food in me, I probably would have eaten despite the fact that I knew I was going to respond negatively to the food because of the fat burner. That's how hungry I was getting. So it started to get to Tuesday night, and I called a friend of mine who is very well versed in this particular fat burner. And I told him that I was contemplating going to the hospital. I basically had two options at that point. That because of the long half-life, I was getting concerned that I didn't want to accidentally fall asleep on the couch from exhaustion, which would have been obviously sitting upright because I was not going to lay down, and then have something terrible happen, like not waking up. So I end up calling him, asking him what he thinks. I did not want to go to the hospital because I felt like if I go to the hospital, they're not going to know how to deal with this fat burner. And the first thing they're going to want to do is put me on a diuretic with an IV to be able to pull off this water, because I knew how dangerous it was, and they would know how dangerous it was that I was holding this much water. I also had the wherewithal, I guess, to know that if they gave me a diuretic, I just might die. So I talked to my friend, and I told him my concerns, and I went with the second option, which was to stay at home, which I live out in the middle of nowhere. So if something were to happen to me at home, I was pretty much screwed. I am roughly 45 minutes from any hospital. I'm 45 minutes from any grocery store, any gym, or anything else. I live out in the middle of fucking nowhere, which is awesome until you're in a situation like that. So I figured I could go to the hospital, I could explain to them and tell them, what the situation was, and that I was not taking a diuretic, but I didn't really feel like going to the hospital and having someone else make a decision for me and have something bad happen to me. As morbid as this sounds, I felt like staying home was the better option and riding it out, because I felt like if I could just ride it out and buy more time, that it would end up passing and I would probably be okay. I felt like I had a better chance staying at home, to be quite honest with you. The other part is this: if something were to happen or have happened to me at home, it was my fault. That really was the bottom line. Even though I felt like I was making relatively logical decisions and I was being careful, whether I was or I wasn't really the issue at that point. The fact was, I made those decisions myself, and if something were to happen to me, it would have been my fault based on those decisions. It just sounds bad to say, but I can live with that. Or I could die with that. Someone else making a decision for me, or insisting that I need something and not knowing how a diuretic or another compound would interact with the situation I was in based on this fat burner, was not something I was willing to do. I even thought to myself, I could see myself going to the hospital, and I get there and it's some intern's second day there who has no clue. And I'm going to put my life and my health in the hands of someone that is new and has no clue. I can't do that. And that may sound arrogant. I'm not in any way sitting here saying that Skip is smarter than an intern or a doctor or anything like that. I've never been like that. I tell people all the time when they're arguing on the internet about how stupid doctors are and bodybuilders pretending that they're so much smarter than doctors, that's not the case. Doctors may not be well versed in the shit that we do to the extremes that we do it. I think they would probably admit that. But a doctor is smarter than this motherfucker, I'm telling you right now. The only thing was I knew that if I were to get the typical, not diagnosis, but the typical medication or a typical treatment of someone coming in who did not take this fat burner and was in congestive heart failure and holding all this water, it was going to be a diuretic, and it would not be good for me. In fact, it would probably be very, very bad. So I decided to ride it out. When I got off the phone with my buddy, I spoke with my wife and explained to her what the situation was. And she's not stupid. She knew I was in trouble before I told her. So I explained to her what I was going to do, hoping that she was comfortable with me not going to the hospital. And she agreed, and she understood, and was very helpful with me trying to, stay up that night and make sure I had everything I needed and that sort of thing. The cool thing was, I just got to the point where I was so exhausted that I figured, you know what, I'm not going to lay down to go to sleep. I'm just going to lay down for me. I just got to rest. I just got to let my muscles just kind of rest. I'm just going to lay down. So I laid down in bed and fell asleep for 5 hours. Yay! Not yay that I fell asleep, I guess, but yay that I fucking woke up. And I woke up and I felt so refreshed. I actually shot out of the bed because I was kind of scared, like, oh my God, did I fall asleep? And I looked at the clock and it was 5 hours later. 5 hours is not a lot of time to sleep. But when you're exhausted and you fall asleep for 5 hours and it feels like it was 5 seconds, you feel pretty good. So I got up and I thought to myself, gosh, I don't feel as heavy in the chest. I don't feel as bad as I did 5 or 6 or 12 hours ago. But I didn't want to get ahead of myself. I just figured, I don't feel terrible. I'm glad that I woke up. So that's better than the alternative. Okay? And please understand, too, while I'm smiling and laughing, it's levity more than it is anything else. The situation was nowhere near funny. And I find humor in a lot of shit. But there was nothing funny about it. It was absolutely just flat out scary. That there's no other way for me to explain it. So it's we're now to the point where it's Wednesday, and as I progress through Wednesday, remember the last dose would have been on Monday, so it's only been 2 days. It's been 48 hours roughly. Get halfway through the day, I'm not feeling too bad. I don't feel like my breathing is bad. I'm not getting full breaths in and really satisfying at the top of my breathing, but I'm getting it enough that my anxiety levels are down, and I'm starting to think you're going to come out of this. This is good. I'm feeling so much better. Blood levels are probably coming down. I knew I still had an electrolyte issue. I was still trying to take my supplements. In fact, I was chewing them before I swallowed them so that I could take that much less, fluid in at that time, and then was sipping on water. So I was starting to get more fluid, though I still had no food. So we're going on, 48 hours with no food while on a very strong fat burner. Okay, so I'm ravenous. And I said I was ravenous the day before. I was ravenous twice over that. Okay, it was just getting worse. But I still was not going to eat anything because the thought of eating something and taking up room in my stomach, I knew what would happen. So anyway, I get later into that day. Okay, and this is Wednesday night, and I think to myself, I'm going to have something small. My breathing's pretty good and everything else. And I probably had it was some thick soup or something. Had about 5 bites. And that was enough to tell me, not a great idea. At this point, I felt like it was the increase in my heart rate from the food, even though it wasn't much food, a little bit of sodium in there, that sort of thing, really kicked up my heart rate. And that made me anxious, and it made my breathing a little bit more labored than it was. It wasn't like it was a day or two prior, but it was enough to be like, well, fuck this, I'm not going to eat this food. I'm going to remain starving and just ride it out. So for the next couple hours, I found myself trying to get those deep, satisfying breaths, and every third or fourth one it would be okay, and the other ones wouldn't go full deep breath, and I'd get a little anxious. Ended up staying up late that night again, and then slept like a rock. And I say Wednesday night, it was actually Thursday morning because I stayed up so late. I probably stayed up till 4, maybe 4:30 in the morning. Slept for almost 12 hours into Thursday. When I got up, I felt pretty good. I knew I wasn't back to normal, but I felt pretty good. I was able to start getting a lot more fluid in, start getting a lot more electrolytes in. The water had started to fall a little bit by that night. Had half a sandwich of something that I made here. Yeah, it took up a little bit of space in my stomach, but I was still able to get full breaths, and I knew that my breathing wasn't anywhere near as bad as it was 2 or 3 days prior. So I felt like I was kind of coming out of the woods at this point. By the time it gets to Friday, I'm feeling pretty good. I want to take the family out. I'm going to go get a meal. I did have a pretty good-sized meal. It wasn't one of those that I was shoveling food like I was skip loading. But I probably had a half a burger and some fries, that sort of thing. And it was incredibly satisfying to be able to get food in me because I was so hungry. And at the same time, for a few hours after that, I was still having the effect of, got to be careful with my breathing, got to be careful. It was a reminder that I need to be careful how much food I'm putting in me. Got into the weekend. Same thing happened on Saturday. I was able to eat a little bit of food, a little bit more food. And it got to the point where, for an hour after I ate, I was a little anxious, going, okay, my breathing, but then I was good. By the time it got to early the next week, I felt like I was almost out of the woods 100%. In fact, I wanted to train, but I knew better. I felt like my heart was tired, is about the best way to explain it. I had had so much going on that prior week, that sun is blazing, that I just decided I'm going to hold off for another week and just play it safe. Didn't want to get in there and find out that, my breathing was a problem after 2 sets of, curls or anything like that. So I got my eating back on track that next week. I did not diet, but I started getting more food in me. My weight had just withered away to nothing. I had dropped about 80 to 90% of that water. So I was back down, closing in on about 212, 215, and there's somewhere where I was at 208, 210 prior to starting the fat burner. So I knew that I was getting back to that 100% level. I ended up starting to train and diet again that following week and really didn't have any problems in the gym. I anticipated that I might be kind of lethargic, a little sluggish. Maybe towards the end of the workout I would have a problem. And I really didn't. My strength didn't fall off. My condition came back very quickly. Think about it. I burned a lot of body fat, I would imagine, while I was starving myself because I couldn't eat for those, 3, 4, 5 days. So I'm sure that I dug into body fat stores quite a bit, burned a little bit extra body fat. And I say that only as a side effect, not like, yay, I got leaner because I fucked myself up. I'm just giving all the information that I can. And I do think that because I wasn't able to eat, it was probably pretty effective in that sense. Not a recommended dieting method, but nonetheless, I came out of it a little bit leaner. Just checking my notes again. Basically, just to recap, really what happened and why things went south is because I was running these cycles too close together. There's only a gap of about 4 weeks in between each DMP cycle. Because of the cumulative effects of running DMP and how rough it is on your system, the half-life being so long, things like that. Looking back now on the second run, I almost feel like half of the issues that I had for that second run may have been from loading, but other people have loaded, and I argued this for quite a while when I was done with the second run where I had gained the water weight, and I thought it was still kind of odd because people load. Still, people have cheat meals, people load and have high days. People even skip load on a fat burner, this fat burner. And they didn't have the problems that I did. So I think the other half of the equation that I didn't know at that time was I had run it too close together. I had run it without enough gap between the first successful run and the second time that I did it. I did the exact same thing going into the third run, and like I said, I feel like it was accumulative. By the time I got to that third run, I may not have known it, but my electrolytes were so fucked up at that point that it didn't take me long to get into the DMP cycle, or the fat burner cycle, before I started having the massive water retention, and was pretty clear that for whatever reason, my electrolytes were in really bad shape. So, if I ever were to use this compound again, I would use it once. I wouldn't run it back to back. I certainly wouldn't run it 4 weeks in between a cycle. If I had to put a time frame on it, it would probably be pretty substantial, maybe even 12 weeks. But a long enough gap, because I think that when you come off of this fat burner, it takes a long time for your electrolytes to get back into that range where they're supposed to be. They may be back to normal to where you feel like, okay, my condition is pretty good and I'm not holding extra water, but that doesn't mean that your electrolytes are exactly where they need to be. So again, being cumulative, things just got worse from an electrolyte standpoint, from the first successful run to the second one that was a little bit less successful to the third one that was disastrous. So I said this at the end of the fat burner chapter. I'm going to say it at the end of this addendum. I really don't feel terribly negative against the fat burner, to be honest. I'm not, all of a sudden you may think, well, now you're probably not going to advocate for it. I'm indifferent, I think. For the large majority of people, it's going to work just fine, and it will just work just fine. For the small amount of people who start to have problems or have problems while they're on it, that's when it can go south very, very quickly. My best advice is if you are going to use it, If you have any sign that things are not going right, just get off. What I did was I tried to fix it, or I tried to push through. And it was potentially one of the worst decisions I've ever made. Because the reality is, as much as I knew I was in trouble at that time, it's weird because when you look back on a situation, you see it much more clearly for what it was than when you're actually in it. Yes, I knew I was in trouble. Yes, I think I understood at that time what the potential ramifications were. But when I look back on it, it's very easy for me to say, you could have been closer to death than you think you were. Closer to having a heart attack, which was my main concern. I felt like if something happened, if I laid down that night to try to sleep, that I was going to have a heart attack. And that's a really shitty, scary feeling. Just because you're trying to get leaner, when I was already lean as hell anyway. All I was trying to do was push the envelope. And because that first run was so successful and I had no problems, if I ran it again, now that there's been this huge gap, it may well be just as effective and have no side effects, just like the first time I ran it. But because I ran it 3 times consecutively without enough time between those cycles, that's what happened. That's my kind of wrap up on the fat burner. I think it provided, quite a bit of, situational experience from what I did. I'm not going to say that, yeah, it's awesome and it's, use it. And take the information that I provided, balance it out with what you know, and make those decisions for yourself. Just know that if you run into any problems while you're on, please do yourself the favor and completely come off ASAP. Do not try to fix the problem.